slides do I just click? Yes, okay. All right, well, I must humbly apologise for my tardiness. Not a great start, but I hope that I can make up for that with this session, which I think is one of the most sort of interesting areas of modern trade policy. And it's one where ASEAN is an absolute global leader, where there's such incredible dynamism that, you know, I'm very envious of the incredibly vibrant region that you come from in this area, which is something that I really look forward to. So just to introduce myself, ko Stephanie Honey aho. I'm Stephanie Honey. I'm a former New Zealand trade negotiator, but I've been a trade policy consultant for many years now. And I do quite a lot of work on digital trade, but I also do quite a lot of teaching of trade policy. So this is really bringing my two loves together. And I've also been so lucky to spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia and working with Southeast Asian colleagues. So I feel like I'm in a friendly room here. I work a lot in the APEC Business Advisory Council. I've got a lot of Southeast Asian colleagues there who are just all fantastic. So it's a real treat to be here today. Now, what I thought we might do, get the technology right for starters. I thought we might go through some sort of quite basic ideas, but then end with a much more sophisticated conversation. So I'm not sure how many of you here might work on digital trade. In fact, let's check that. Who in this room has done some work in digital trade policy before, or knows anything about it? Maybe a few of you. Yeah, I can see a few shy hands. Well, the thing is, it would be amazing if everybody in this room knew about it, because it is such a new area of trade policy. Even the real world experts have only been doing it for a few years now, because it's such a rapidly changing part of trade policy. So I thought we might start with some of the basics. What is this thing that we're talking about, digital trade? And then we can talk about what the sort of global trends are and what some of the blockages are to that trade happening. Then we might look at the rules, and that's something that's very relevant to Southeast Asia at the moment, because you are probably aware that ASEAN is in the middle of negotiating a very cutting edge, world-leading new digital economy framework agreement. And then lastly, we're going to have a discussion about putting all of those building blocks together into what should the strategy be in your own economies or for ASEAN as a whole for digital trade. So let's get going. Firstly, what is digital trade? Can anybody give me some examples of digital trade? So for instance, one thing might be, I bought my phone on Amazon. That's one example. E-commerce. Are there any other examples you can think of?
Subscription. You can look at digital trade as digitally created goods or digital technology itself, like streaming.
Exactly. So streaming is a great example. In our house, we argue over whether we're going to watch, Netflix or Prime Video. So yeah, streaming's a great example. And digital goods. What do you mean by digital goods? Could you give me an example of that?
So digitally traded goods can be a physical good that you order online. That's one example.
Yes.
But digital good can also be like a software that you can download.
Software is a great example.
So there are different aspects of digital trade.
That's exactly right. Can anybody think of any other examples?
Cloud storage.
Cloud storage, perfect. Any others?
Redmi. Fintech.
Fintech, yeah, you've got some great ideas there. There are also these things, when you mentioned digital goods, I thought that maybe you might be going to say they're things that were once physical, so for example a book, that you can now consume digitally, so it might be an e-book or something like that. So all great examples, and I've put a few of those on the slide there. So I'm sure you recognise all of these little logos. Some great Southeast Asian businesses in the mix there as well. If you've got teenage boys like I do, you'll know all about, yeah. And what's this one? Does anybody recognise this logo?
ChatGPT.
Yeah, that's right. If I'd asked that question 3 years ago, everybody would have been like, what? What's she talking about? But it's now everywhere, isn't it, AI? What about the old economy? What about things like agriculture or manufacturing? Is there any digital in those?
Like selling goods via digital platforms.
Exactly, very much so. So there's a lot of that going on. Any other aspects of those sort of more, old-fashioned kinds of trade that are now digitalised, do you think?
Like, I guess, again, with banking, a lot of the transactions and stuff
Exactly.
are done through fintech instead of...
That's right. So lots of the services that make the trade go are now digitalised. And then there are also things like at the border, a lot of those processes have become digitalised. So if you're buying, some butter or some milk or something, you might have heard this term paperless trade, where all the trade administration documents are digitalised. So this was actually an example from a few years ago in New Zealand. Our big dairy company, Fonterra, was in a partnership with Alibaba. So this is really quite old now, 2018, but that was one of our sort of initial forays into digitalised trade. So they sold New Zealand milk in Alibaba supermarkets and Hema supermarkets, and you could scan the QR code and see exactly where that bottle of milk was made, when it landed in China and so on. So there's a lot of digitalisation, even in sectors that you might think, well, it's got nothing to do with digital. And we can really see it throughout the sort of trade pipeline, if you like. So we've got things that are inherently digital. Before the internet, they just didn't exist. So things like we already mentioned a few, cloud storage or software or apps and sort of search and so on. We've got digitally delivered goods, so things that might once have been physical that are then able to come to you in your home digitally. Netflix we've mentioned, or streaming, other sorts of streaming, Spotify, ebooks and so on. Then we've got physical goods that can have the digitalisation of the process of trading in them. So they might be digitally ordered but physically delivered, like a book, but also things like the sharing economy. And I had that logo of Gojek before, things that the sort of the transaction is digitalised, even if the service is delivered physically or the goods delivered physically. And then we've got sort of enablers of trade. So I mentioned the paperless trade, and the gentleman up there talked about fintech, but there are actually lots of those that make the seamless digital transaction happen. So things like digital identities, cyber security, single windows, all of those that are about the process of the transaction. And then this sort of exciting new fast-moving frontier of digital technology. So generative AI, as I mentioned, Internet of Things. Does anybody know what is the Internet of Things? That's a term you hear tossed around. What does it actually mean?
Sort of like when all kinds of systems are integrated into like a central kind of digital system.
Up to a point, yes. And what did you say, the gentleman in the front there?
I think the Internet thing is like basically is that everything is connected to each other via the internet. So
exactly, yeah. So both of you are kind of right. Essentially, it's about connected devices. So they might be sensors, they might be your fridge or your toaster or your television connected to the internet. Robotics and automation, so that's things like factories. A lot of manufacturing is now done with digitally enabled robots that might have AI in them. What's 3D printing? Does anybody know what that is? Yeah?
When you make isn't it when you make a model on like a 3D sort of a model, and then you can use that to print out the model to the exact specifications?
That's right, yeah. So you've got a piece of software, a kind of an instruction manual for your printer that can physically print something. So that's actually something that in some areas of manufactured trade is now replacing a physical good going on a ship across an ocean. You just send the software digitally and they can print it at the other end. What about quantum computing? I mean, that's really the big new buzzword. What is that? Has anybody heard of that? Want to take a stab at what that is?
I think it's like computer architecture that is not reliant on the typical binary sort of system that we use every day, but it uses the quantum architecture that allows for instantaneous sort of like data transfer from one to another. without going through-
Exactly. It's an enormously powerful new kind of computer. And the relevance of it here is, if we think generative AI, ChatGPT is kind of amazing, well, quantum is that times, exponentially more impressive. And the implications of it for things like fintech or sort of cross-border payments, but also cybersecurity and so on, that is still mostly in the lab, although it's just starting to be commercialised, but that will make a big difference to how a lot of the sort of transaction piece works in the future. Oops. Okay, so you can see it's a big universe, this thing, digital trade. And let's put some numbers around it. Well, it's, as we'll come to, incredibly hard to measure and kind of get an accurate accounting of how big the digital economy is. But a couple of years ago, UNCTAD thought it was nearly 16% of the global economy. For ASEAN, not by 2023, that was terrible brain, sort of short circuit on my account. ASEAN has been estimated that its digital economy by 2030, not by 2023, might be worth up to $2 trillion, and it's well over half of global services trade. So it's a really big thing. And if we'd been looking at those same metrics a few years ago, they would have been much, much smaller. So one of the very interesting things about it is it's growing so quickly, it's becoming ubiquitous, and yet, as we'll see, a lot of the rules about it and sort of regulatory settings are still a long way behind. So I thought it might be interesting to look at how does this growth story actually work. And one of the most important and most impressive elements is data. So you can think about cross-border flows of data as being the lifeblood of digital trade. It's essentially the little packages of information that are needed for any of these amazing things to happen. And essentially, if you don't have a flow of data, you probably are not going to see any digital trade taking place. And as you can see from this chart, which was from UNCTAD a few years ago, just over essentially the last kind of 2 decades, there's been this incredible growth of cross-border data flows. So as a sort of proxy for digital trade, so you can see back in 2004, sort of reasonable flows between Asia, the US, and between the US and Europe, but not a lot happening elsewhere in the world. Then over the next decade, really thickening up and growing, and then a huge sort of step change by this decade that we're in now. Massive. You can see if you sort of compare the thickness of these flows and the breadth of the flows, there's been a really significant increase in cross-border data flows. And what does that mean for trade? Well, it's estimated that even a decade ago, the sort of value piece of the cross-border data flows was worth more than global trade in goods. That was a decade ago, and if you look at what's happened since then, I mean, we're talking a really significant value creation that's happened. Now, of course, if you ask a person in the street what's digital trade, they are not smart trade officials like you, and so they'll probably say, oh, well, I bought something on an e-commerce platform, that's digital trade. But this has also grown very significantly, and ASEAN is right at the forefront of both buying and selling on these e-commerce platforms, so things like Shopee or Lazada. And most people, again, if you ask somebody on the street, what is it? They would be thinking about me as an individual consumer buying something. There's a lot of that happening. And that's true. But actually, what's even more significant is business-to-business e-commerce. So there's a lot of cross-border trade that happens between businesses and sort of intermediate services or intermediate goods that happens on platforms. And the World Economic Forum has estimated that over the next decade, 70%, so nearly 3/4 of global sort of value creation will come from platforms. So that's another really important thing to think about. Platforms are a big part of this digital trade picture. And another really significant story in digitally delivered trade or digital trade is digitally deliverable services. Now, note that heading, it says digitally deliverable. What do you think that means? What kind of services are we talking about there?
Shipping.
What's that, sorry?
Good shipping.
Goods shipping is one of them. Yeah, it's any kind of service that you could deliver digitally. So at the moment, remember we saw that figure earlier that about half of services are delivered digitally. But actually, if you look at the universe of what could be delivered, it's much bigger. So we've also seen this really interesting trend where over the last few years, more and more services are being delivered digitally. So, you know, initially things like, you know, financing or payments, you think, okay, well, yeah, I know that can work. I use my credit card online. That's pretty straightforward. What about, can anybody think of an outrageous example of a physical service that can now be delivered digitally?
Groceries.
What was it, sorry? Education, exactly. I mean, I could be beaming into your offices back in Southeast Asia. What's it, another one? Sorry.
Medical.
Consultation.
Consultation, yeah, go the trained consultants.
Shopping, groceries.
Shopping, groceries. What about surgery? Yeah, that can be done, can't it? Or haircuts, you could probably get a robot to cut your hair digitally. So this universe of services is of what you might call digitally delivered services is getting bigger and bigger. And if we look at the story of how that trajectory is going, so how many of these are happening, if we look at goods kind of going along, pretty reasonable sort of growth, it's had its ups and downs. If we look at other services, big dip, what do you think happened here? Why was there this big dip? COVID, that's right, because lots of services require you to be near a person, not a good idea in COVID. But digitally delivered services, I mean, look at that. It's like the rock star of global trade. They're just, nothing's slowing them down. They're going amazingly. And if we compare that to the sort of, this is a chart of goods trade. So you can see over history, you know, going 1870, you know, not a lot of growth, and then some bad times between the two world wars, and then with the start of the WTO and the GATT, you know, this amazing story of growth. But since the 2010s, there's actually been what McKinsey has called globalisation. So kind of, there's still trade happening, but it's not really going that impressively. You know, it's had dips. There's another dip. Does anybody know what that one is? Global financial crisis. So, you know, goods trade, kind of not that exciting. Digitally delivered services, amazing. So all of this is to say, this stuff might seem very, you know, weird, who really cares about digital trade, but actually it's affecting every part of the global trading system, so it's very good to know a bit about how it all works. And another important thing, if you only care about goods trade, there's a lot of facilitation of trade that is now becoming digitalised. So the platform economy that we talked about, and paperless trade, digital single windows, another area where ASEAN is really world leading. All of those tools to make the transaction work better, so electronic invoicing, electronic payments, electronic contracts, digital identities. What's a digital identity? Can anybody take a stab at that one? Or do you know what it is?
A way to identify if you're the person that signed the document, for example.
Exactly. So it can be about people. How do I assert and verify my identity online as an individual? But it can also be about companies. So is this a legitimate company, and is this really that company that's doing this transaction with me? It can be, pardon me, about goods. So individual, you know, physical sort of items can have a digital identity. So this is a really important kind of building block of a lot of the trade transactions. And then I put that phrase up there, trade in parcels. Has anybody read, there's a really great paper that the OECD's written about trade in parcels. You may not have come across it, but what do you think that might be talking about?
Is this the de minimis shipments of small items?
That's right. Because in the olden days of 10 years ago, maybe your trade might have been in a big container. You might have sent a whole container of, you know, palm oil or dairy products or meat or whatever it was to your customer in another country. But now, an individual can essentially be involved in trade by buying a small parcel on the internet and essentially importing it or exporting it. And so what this means for customs officials, I'm not sure if there are any customs people in the room, but what that means is, in the good old days, you just look at a container, and now you might have 1 million small packages that you need to deal with. So that, for officials, I mean, it's great for a consumer, I can buy anything I want, but if you're an official, that is a really big nightmare change to how you actually, do your job. So some really important implications for how governments organise themselves. All of that, so we've now looked at all these different kinds of digital trade, so how do we bring that together into a definition? And a number of the big sort of economic institutions, so OECD, WTO, IMF, UNCTAD, have come together and come up with this definition. So digitally enabled transactions, there needs to be some part of the transaction that has a digital element in trade in goods and services. So it's not just about the weightless stuff, it can be physically goods too, whether digitally or physically delivered. And they reckon that captures most of what goes on, although there are probably nuances about, some very digital first kind of, in the cloud models where that doesn't quite work. But essentially, this is the definition that most people use now for digital trade. So, okay, we know what it is. How on earth do we measure it? And I don't know if any of you have looked at this area at all to any extent, but it's incredibly hard to count what is digital trade. Why do you think that might be?
There's more lines are being blurred about what is digital and what is no longer digital. Even the kind of more traditional kind of trade, some parts of it also become digitalized in some ways.
Exactly, and unfortunately, most people's trade statistics don't say, oh, well, this bit was digital, but this was physical. We just count it all as the same. So there's a lot of blurring of the lines, exactly right. Some of it is just not even visible at all. So, how does a government keep an eye on what might be happening in the cloud? It might not be very obvious to any sort of official kind
Especially
of process.
if they also use crypto to pay for certain.
Exactly. It's meant to be secret or kind of hidden, and so it's very hard to keep visibility. There are also some really weird things about the way global data flows work, which mean it can be very hard to actually say where something's come from and where it's going to. Just technologically, the way that data goes around the world, it's often broken up into little packets, and each packet might take a different route to the final destination. So things like sort of counting, if it's on a ship going from A to B, you can definitely see where the ship leaves and where it's going to arrive. But in fact, with data, it's much more difficult. And also, something else that's really interesting about this, I think, there's a lot about digitally enabled trade that really fundamentally turns some of our old economic ideas about trade on its head. So there are usually low cost to entry, and I think if any of you work with businesses that are physical businesses that sell goods, it's really hard to export, it's expensive, it's difficult, you need to know a lot. But any one of you or me could sit at your kitchen table at home and start selling services to a customer on the other side of the world. So it's very low cost to entry, it's instant reach, and then there are also these other things, network effects. So often the first person to think of a clever idea can capture a big share of the market. So all of those things kind of really turn a lot of the economics on their head. As well, as I mentioned before, individual consumers can now be involved in trade, whereas in the past it was only big companies would do importing. Now I could import something from Southeast Asia, without any sort of hassle at all. And also, a lot of and this also goes to how you measure it, a lot of the value that can be created doesn't necessarily have a financial transaction associated with it. So, that old saying, if the product is free, or if the service is free, you're the product. And so to sort of illustrate that, I've got this fun little cartoon here, two pigs having a conversation. This one's saying, isn't it great? You pay nothing for the barn. And then this other guy's saying, yeah, even the food's free. But what's going to happen to those? They're having a great time, but just like for us as consumers, our data, in their case it's a little bit more personal than the data, a lot of the transactions when you use search or if you use ChatGPT, it's free, it's amazing, but they are getting something from you in that transaction as well. But please keep using ChatGPT, I'm not trying to put you off. Okay, so digital trade, pretty exciting, lots of great money to be made, but there are a lot of things that affect digital trade that aren't actually about trade. Can anybody think of any of those things?
Privacy.
Privacy, yeah, that's a really good one. So anytime I engage on the internet, particularly if I don't have a good sort of digital identity, my privacy is at risk, isn't it? And governments put in place rules around privacy which have an impact on whether I can buy and sell as easily online. What else are people worried about or excited about, or
Security.
security? What do you mean by that?
There's a potential for basically the data being leaked or being hacked by.
Exactly, and I mean, if you read any statistics about sort of cybercrime and cybersecurity, probably, even if you might not realise it, just, lots of people in this room have probably had some sort of cyber, their data's been leaked or somebody's got them in a phishing scam or they've been hacked. What else?
Fraud.
Fraud, yeah, another big one. Pretty easy to make things up with, deep fakes or whatever. And we even see in things like, elections, lots of questions about, misrepresentation, misinformation, disinformation. What else?
Property.
Yeah, exactly. So there are lots and lots of things that governments regulate or should regulate that affect digital trade that have got nothing to do with digital trade. So we've mentioned lots of these, but some others. There's a whole lot about inclusion and how do we make sure that there's sort of fair and inclusive growth for everybody in the world of digital trade. As we've just discussed, not everything is necessarily on a level playing field, and the economics are kind of not, in the traditional way, as well as personal sort of cyber security. Lots of countries are now starting to think about national security or economic security, however you might define that, through this lens as well. Lots of pressures for, between the US and China for decoupling in this digital space. So yeah, lots and lots of things that affect digital trade that have really got nothing to do with, can I watch my favourite movie on Netflix? One term here we haven't exactly talked about, data sovereignty or digital sovereignty. Has anybody heard that phrase before?
I think this is related to cloud servicing. So, for example, if I'm a government, but I use a cloud service, I would want that data to be located within my jurisdiction.
Great, yeah, that's the perfect example. So this idea that, it's my data, I want it to be physically in my jurisdiction, my territory. And why do you think that? Why would you think having it in your own country would?
It's actually related to economic security as well.
Yeah.
So you would want to have control over your data.
Okay. So I guess the argument there is, I'll come to you in 1 second, but the argument is around if it's in my legal jurisdiction, I have more control over it. Yeah. What were you going to add?
Basically, it's about storing data within a domestic server that a legal jurisdiction can have control over, and it's also related to limited the sort of expansion of certain conglomerates that have a very deep kind of penetration, and with the global scale that they're able to access this data and they can make a lot of money from this data from these countries. So for a country that is also maybe trying to grow their own digital economies that would also want to just not allow competitors to just easily access their kind of national data, and they would also want to store that data within their country so they could also use that to grow their own digital economies as well. So.
Excellent. So 2 fantastic answers there. So there are a lot of facets to this sovereignty discussion, but some are around sort of legal control and protection. I want to make sure it's safe, and so I want it to be covered by my own legal jurisdiction. There's a kind of a sort of an anti-big tech, or the flip side of it as sort of an infant industry protection. I want my data to be underneath my own economic control as well. And then there are also, I guess, potentially kind of cyber crime elements to it as well. Now, those are all true, and that's a very live debate at the moment about how do you define it, what does it mean? If you were a cloud-based business in another country, how do you think you would feel about data sovereignty? So you're wanting to sell digital services into another market, but they say, oh no, you've got to be physically in this market to do that.
Well, obviously, like Microsoft and Facebook and Meta and all these tech corporations, they don't really like that. They don't really try
They don't
to.
like that. What about Honey Consulting? I want to teach this trade policy course in, let's say, Singapore, but Singapore says to me, no, you have to have a local server to provide that. You can't do it sitting at your kitchen table in New Zealand. So there are some very strong arguments in favour of data sovereignty, but there are also some arguments around why you might want to limit that to some extent, because the sort of, on the economic side of things, the more restrictions you put in around data flows, that comes at a cost, potentially for small businesses, your neighbours, small businesses who might be, a kind of vulnerable group. So this is a really fascinating issue because there are such good arguments in both directions for either having a lot of sovereignty or not so much. And in New Zealand, it's a very live debate as well, because the Indigenous people of New Zealand, the Māori, have got a very strong view and sort of a kind of cultural and philosophical belief that data is a taonga, it's a treasure that should not be allowed to just be, flow freely and be stored in another country. So there's also this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty, where my Indigenous data has to stay in New Zealand in this case because, it's got a special quality about it. So this is one of the most interesting areas, I think, of, there are no clear answers in either direction. It's not a slam dunk for either side, but a lot of very important issues that people are trying to sort of navigate their way through to find the sort of best outcome. But we'll come back to that. That's very closely linked to a phrase that you might have heard, forced data localisation. So that's the idea where you're compelled to store or process or handle particular data in the other country, so in the market. But we'll come back to that. So having just talked a little bit about that, what are some of the barriers to digital trade happening? Can anybody give me a few ideas about what would a digital trade barrier look like? We know in the world of goods, one might be a tariff, for example. There might be a 50% tariff. That's essentially a barrier to trade happening. What about in the digital world?
Infrastructure.
What was that, sorry?
Infrastructure such as facilitation to support data transaction.
Yep. Any others?
Domestic regulation.
Domestic regulations, that's right. In fact, almost all of these things we're going to talk about are domestic regulations, which might not even be aimed at trade, but they're about, organising the domestic economy, but have the effect of stopping or making it more difficult or more expensive to do trade digitally. So let's have a look at some of them. So the biggest category probably relate to how data flows. Can it go across the border? Do you have to meet any particular standards or conditions or requirements? And often restrictions on cross-border data don't really look like, I mean, there's no big flashing red light that says there's a trade barrier or there's even a data restriction. So it might be things like forced data localisation that we were just talking about, so sovereignty. So countries might think, I want to, for economic reasons or security reasons or legal reasons, I want to store the data in my country. So lots of countries have rules that say you have to process personal data in my market, or you have to store financial data in my market. So it might look like that. So in New Zealand, for example, we have data localisation for, I think it's sort of tax records. So you've got to keep data about your taxation activities in New Zealand. It might look like privacy regulations that we mentioned before. So who here has seen a little pop-up when you go to the website that says cookies, accept cookies? Yeah, the bane of everybody's life. So that is a privacy regulation. That's me agreeing that they can kind of track my path through the internet. What about restrictions on payments or financial services? So lots of companies find it is very expensive to do business across a border because the cost of getting the money is very expensive. You know, there are lots of fees or whatever. Or there might be national security requirements, cybersecurity requirements. So there are lots of things to do with data which are essentially extra costs or barriers to digital trade. Now, why have I put a picture of a skeleton there? You might be wondering, what on earth is this course? Well, that's because in China, for example, in video games, you're not allowed to have images of sort of death or skeletons. So I do a lot of work with the New Zealand video game sector. You know, it's really small but exciting kind of growth sector for New Zealand. But they say, oh, it's terrible, I've made this amazing game where everybody's killing each other all the time. You know, my sons would love that. Lots of shooting, but you can't, you know, I've had to take out all the images of skeletons because otherwise I'm not allowed to sell it in China. What's a local presence requirement?
You have to establish an entity within the jurisdiction.
Exactly, that's right. So even if you might be a cloud provider or, you know, somebody who's just selling sort of, you know, over the internet, you might still have to have a physical or a legal establishment in the market. Or you might have a rule where, yep, you can sell your services in that market, but you have to be in a partnership with a local company, or there, you know, there's something about the corporate structure. There needs to be half the senior managers have to be, you know, from the local market. And then there's this other idea that, okay, all of those things, maybe they're expensive, difficult, whatever, but the overall weight of regulation is in itself a barrier to trade. Because if I'm Honey Consulting and I want to do some business digitally, and then I think, oh, well, where can I sell? You know, can I go to Timor-Leste or Thailand or Malaysia? You know, where can I go? Oh, I don't really understand the rules about privacy or data or storing my data or cybersecurity. So even the very fact that there are lots and lots of different rules about this can be a barrier. And this noodle bowl, or it used to be called the spaghetti bowl, is an idea that actually came from goods trade, where rules of origin, I'm not sure if any of you work on rules of origin, but this idea that lots of complicated rules of origin for goods mean just for an exporter that makes life very difficult. It's hard to figure out what to do to meet the rules. And we can see the same in the digital world. So unfortunately, even though digital trade is growing incredibly, so are digital trade restrictions. And I hate to say it, but it's particularly in our region, the Asia Pacific. So this red line is the growth of restrictions over time in the Asia Pacific. And we are the champions for trade restriction. We're the champions for trade, but also for trade restrictions. And what do these restrictions look like? So the big blue chunk of this chart here, so 64%, so nearly 2/3 of the barriers are to do with infrastructure and connectivity, including those restrictions on data flows, or, forced data localization and privacy and all of those other things. Then there's another big chunk which is relating to electronic transactions. So that's things about how does the transaction actually take place. So do I recognise an electronic signature, or is an electronic document legally valid, or do I have a framework for how electronic transactions take place? So there are lots of those as well. And this is fundamentally about, do all the countries you want to do business with have the basic regulatory building blocks in place for the digital economy? And in the case of New Zealand, for example, even a rich, sort of trade-obsessed country like New Zealand does not have all of this in place. So, for example, one of the key trade documents that we don't legally recognise is electronic bills of lading. You can have a piece of paper to make your trade transaction, but if it's electronic, no legal status. So this is a really big headache for lots of domestic policy agencies. It's like, my God, how do we upgrade and update our regulations for the modern world? It's not easy. Then there are lots of sort of other little smaller barriers relating to protection of intellectual property, relating to payment systems, and then a whole lot of other barriers which might be around, for instance, content, skeletons, or are you allowed to do online advertising, and a whole bunch of other things. But you can see data is the big thing there. And I thought it would just be interesting to see, what does this noodle bowl look like? What's the fragmentation? So this is a little chart that I've put together of, in our neighbourhood, so kind of the Asia Pacific, what are the trade agreements that we can see that have digital provisions, or there are these new kind of agreements, digital economy agreements. So if you look, there's a lot of amazing dynamism in Southeast Asia and with New Zealand, where we love doing these digital provisions. And then some from outside, that grouping as well, but in the sort of wider APEC or Asia Pacific region, there's this new WTO commerce agreement that was kind of mostly finished last year, still hasn't quite got it fully across the line. But as you can see, if you're an exporter looking out into the global marketplace, and there might be slightly different rules or even very different rules across all of these agreements, how difficult is that as a landscape? If I'm, honey consulting, sitting at my kitchen table trying to, teach trade policy, if I have to meet different rules in all of those different markets, that's a very challenging space to operate in. So one of the big drivers in the world of digital trade is to say, we've all got lots of great ideas, but let's try and bring them together into a coherent, sort of seamless global digital market. And that was really the driver of this WTO agreement, to say, there's lots of stuff happening, let's have a global rule book for this instead of the noodle bowl. Okay, are there any questions on what we've done so far? No questions. Hopefully that's good. But please do interrupt me at any time. Now, the last thing I talk about before we move on to the rules is something that's really, it's a bit like all those non-trade things, privacy or cybersecurity, whatever. It's not actually about trade, but it's fundamental to the ability of businesses and countries to participate in digital trade, which is around the domestic capacity. So there are lots of things that might make it very hard for your economy or your businesses to actually participate in digital trade. And a really big but very critical kind of threshold thing is around infrastructure. So do you have enough essentially digital, physical and kind of services infrastructure to enable digital trade to work? And that can be something as basic as, how wide is your broadband coverage or satellite coverage of access to the internet, but it can also be things like how expensive is it to access? You know, if it's very, very expensive to have access to the internet or to get data, that's going to inhibit your ability or the ability of your businesses to participate. How fast is it? So if you talk to, for instance, video game companies, they say, oh, well, if there's too much lag, or it's probably true of AI as well, if there's too much lag, you know, you're not going to give the customer a good experience. So essentially my product is not as attractive. So that's a really important piece. Something else that's really critical is the regulatory building blocks. So this is something that, you know, as domestic sort of policy agencies, some of you will know this very well. You know, you might have great aspiration, but actually getting the right legislation in place or the right regulations and updating them, often there might be a sort of legacy thing, like I mentioned with our bills of lading. We've got laws about bills of lading, but they were written in the days before the internet, and so, you know, they need to be updated. And this is a real issue for basic trade legislation, but also in sort of new areas like cybersecurity and how do you protect consumers online and so on. And then there are a whole lot of other things to do with, you know, specific technologies like e-payments. You might have a sort of a standards deficit where everybody just goes off and does their own thing on standards and there's no sort of interoperability. And also around sort of siloed approaches to policy making. All of your individual policy agencies might have great ideas, but they might not all be, you know, operating in the same space. And then there's also the human beings in the mix, like how do we actually understand what we're doing? How do I use ChatGPT? You know, how do I actually use a system that might be working for digital documents and so on? Okay, we've got a few minutes before the morning tea break. It's at 11, yes. Correct? Yeah. Okay, so in our few minutes before the morning tea break, I thought we might take a quick look at some of the rules piece and essentially get through to digital economy agreements. So we've looked at what digital trade is, what are some of the barriers to it. So what about on the other side, what are some of the enablers? So let me actually just go back a bit. Go back. Okay. Let me ask you this. Why would you bother with rules for digital trade? I'm going to suggest that at each table you just have a quick chat and come up with 2 reasons why you'd bother with rules for digital trade. So if you can sort of cluster around each of the table. Sorry, you two will just have to talk to each other. And the poor gentleman who's at the table by himself just brainstorm. So just have a minute thinking about why would you bother with digital trade rules?
The finance department.
From the finance department.
No, I mean
Source of revenue. Source of revenue. Yes.
What was the
Digital service.
Digital still.
Actually, I think most recently, last 1 or 2 years, Meta. Yeah, Meta. Just for their services to be taxed. Because it's legally.
Okay, who's got even one reason why you would bother with digital trade rules they'd like to share? One reason?
For us, a common thing is we did it to tax the entities that are technically not present in our country.
Poor entities getting taxed. That's okay. Okay, that's a good reason. Yeah. So governments might want to be able to collect revenue from this very vibrant sector. Great. Any other reasons why you'd put in place?
I would say a lot of the rules that are being put up that seem contrary to maybe the free trade sort of sort of like principles around physical manufacturing has to do with the fact that while the U.S. is sort of like has a like relative disadvantage when it comes to physical manufacturing, it has like a near absolute kind of primacy when it comes to like the digital trade in goods and services. So I would say a lot of the rules being put up by countries doing regulations around the world, other than the U.S., have to do with themselves kind of being protectionist against that. Like they
So
want,
protecting themselves against the US dominant.
which is in contrary to the U.S. sort of Trump tariffs in manufacturing.
Okay, great. Any other reasons? What about this table? Did you come up with any to share?
You already mentioned about safety
Yeah.
and misinformation. I think we need to protect the customers.
Perfect. Okay, so there's a sort of consumer protection reason. Great one. Any others? What about you ladies in the front? Did you have anything that hasn't been said?
Should I say it later again?
Going from the DEFA for the countries that has yet.
Great, so it's sort of a model for everybody to kind of learn together. Love it. What about the giant table up the back? Did you guys come up with any?
Consumer and business protections.
Yep, perfect. Consumer protection. Yep. Very good. Any other ideas from you guys? No? Yes.
I think digital trade
Yeah.
usually be free before it is not regulated as right now. Yes, but now because of the like someone said. Protection of the consumers,
Yes.
and then there are some protection of the data sovereignty. So there are a lot of regulation to be imposed to restrict. Actually, it's restrict digital trade, and it is very difficult to identify the scope of the entities that is subject to the rules for digital trade, because it's not as day and night like a traditional trade. Yes, but now it's very difficult to regulate the scope of the rules.
Great one. Yeah, and I mean also, I think you're absolutely right. All this stuff is happening, and including restrictions, but also opportunities, and it's mostly happened without any sort of guardrails, hasn't it? So governments, regulators love regulating, so of course we see, governments thinking not just for revenue reasons, but also for just sort of understanding and being able to control what's happening in the market. Right? And the last couple of tables, did you come up with any ideas that have to be mentioned?
All about the trade.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. All those other things we talked about. Yeah, perfect.
Something about racism, about
Yeah. Exactly, perfect, great. And you guys, did you have anything to add? No? Yeah,
I think that we need to go for promoting better cooperation between countries to join the house.
that's right, yeah. I mean, another really exciting thing I think about lots of these new digital economy agreements is they are a way for countries to actually upskill themselves, participate and learn from the insights of your colleagues. So this is our last slide before we break for morning tea, but here were some ideas that I put down, but I think you've all come up with some fantastic, some of them the same, some different ones. So businesses want a predictable environment. They don't want the noodle bowl. They want one nice, easy to understand set of rules. And consumers want to be able to have trust and confidence. They're not going to get scammed. They're not going to get ripped off. Nobody's going to steal their data. Also, there's a lot of value that could be realised from the digital economy and digital trade. So, if you're a government, you care about sustainable growth in your economy, you want to equip your businesses for new trade opportunities. And sometimes, even where systems might be out there, they don't interoperate across borders. So policymakers think, I can see their great paperless trade system and I've got one too, but our businesses can't really benefit because the systems don't talk to each other. So there's a sort of a cooperation piece there as well. Rising barriers, unfortunately, protectionism is, kind of the story of trade everywhere, including in cyberspace. And then emerging technologies like AI. So there's been a very interesting discussion over the last few years, really since, ChatGPT entered the world, about does AI mean we need new rules? And I think nobody has a definitive answer on that yet. So some countries are choosing to say no, maybe we just need to tweak our existing rules. So that's what New Zealand is doing. We don't have an AI Act, we're just adjusting some of our rules to where it might be needed. But other countries like China or the EU are saying no, we need a whole new AI piece of legislation to deal with this amazing new thing. So lots of rules. Let's leave it there and have a very well-earned cup of tea. And when we come back after the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the rules look like, including in digital economy agreements. And then I'm going to be very interested to hear what you think are the main strategic priorities. So thanks very much for your attention. And Juanita, do they know where
Thank you so much. So we are going now to morning tea. Today, the morning tea is going to be on the 3rd floor. So similar place where we were yesterday, but yesterday we were on this 2nd floor. So today, take the elevator, and Tita is going to be guiding us. Let's go.
Tanong mo AI legislation may nagde-develop na AI legislation AI China may CTP feeling ko may nagde-develop baka hindi lang as
Grab it here.
Okay, I'm fine. I'm so sorry, you should have said
We want this just leave it because yesterday the business was here.
I will be up there in a second, I just need to double check.
So it's just going on the elevator. So I called like an hour ago or an hour and a half ago regarding a mic on the room I am at the moment, and the person said they were going to come, but they are not coming. And yes, so the microphone is not working, the inalambric one, and we were thinking that maybe we need a replacement or the microphone that you can grab and just walk with it. Let me tell you the room, please. Yeah, hold on. Hold on. So is the Edith Winston Blackwell room, case room, on the second floor? So 260, 223? The inalambric one, no, it's not. I mean, it works if you grab it with your hand and put it right next to your mouth, but not if you put it in the t-shirt. Oh, that's okay. Same number. Oh, maybe it was my colleague. Maybe she. Okay. Okay. Maybe it was a different person. I mean, a different phone because it was my colleague. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye. Oh, hello.
Yeah, sorry, this is the first time I got the phone call.
Oh, I thought we called you, but it was my colleague who called, so I don't know.
No, because I've only had one conversation today, but it wasn't about the mic or anything like that. So let me just check.
Yeah, so it only works when you put it next to your mouth?
Let me check.
I think it's...
1 2 1 2 1 2. Oh, yeah, I see. Let's try reset the whole thing. Okay, that. Okay, so it's okay. One two one two 1 2. Might be the key.
She's happy to have the other microphone. Remember that you showed me yesterday?
Yes, I do have that somewhere. I think it's in the office now.
Okay, no worries.
So we can do this. I just need to figure out what's going on. Oh, okay. No, we left them here. We left them here.
Okay.
So, I think I want to try. Do any of this. That's good news. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, what about 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, let's just peel it. When do you need to use the mic again?
Just in 10 minutes?
It's not going to have enough battery.
That's okay. But if it's only for the afternoon, that will be.
Oh, okay. Because I can change it. It's just not got enough battery.
Okay.
I've got some spare cables and some spare ones of these. Do you mind if I go downstairs and just grab another one of these?
That's
I've got a feeling it could just be the cable.
Yes.
So I'm going to grab my spares. I'll be back up.
Okay.
We can pair all of this stuff. Like I can definitely get this going. It's a matter of when do you first need to use it?
Make
it probably
the sooner the better.
Yeah, okay. Because it still needs about like 30 to 60 minutes to charge for a full day. I'll go downstairs really quickly.
Thank you so much.
Replace this.
We appreciate it.
That's all right. Yeah, sorry. I wasn't too sure when you called me what it was about.
Okay.
But my boss was here this morning and the phone went to him, so it's likely him.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll be back.
No worries.
Thank you.
Pasalubungan na to. Masyado siyang mahal.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Pwede bang fence? focus na sagot na.
Hindi naman mo. Yun naman talaga ang ano.
Yun ang intensyon natin.
Oo. Hindi, tsaka kasi ginagawa din siya ng iba. Kasi,
cái bạn tương lai không hãy cầm ra không?
Anong gusto niyong gawin? Yun yung plan.
The last weekend.
ikaw, Latis. Ako okay lang ako sa utilization.
Utilization, FTA.
O gusto mong palitan ng de minimi?
Either naman.
Ha? Any?
Kung utilization, yung inisip ko, yung parang question na lang natin is who benefits from the ASEAN agreement, the FTAs? Or who benefits the most? Is it ASEAN country or ASEAN plus like China?
What do you mean?
Is it parang kaya
Saan tayo
yung,
mas nag-import?
kung sino yung mas nagbe-benefit, anong country yung nagbe-benefit? So basically, sinong pinaka nag-cite ng FTA provisions sa pag nag-import sila sa Pilipinas?
So sa atin pa din naka-focus.
Oo, pero yung gagawin
Kasi yun yung
natin-
data na
Oo,
meron
yun
ka.
yung- pero para maging ASEAN siya, parang it's ASEAN plus or is it ASEAN country na benefit?
Minsan nga tayo, mabigyan.
Mali yung strategy. I mean, sobrang mali to. Diba? You're supposed to start with the question and then we're gonna start tayo sa answer na.
Oo nga po.
Ano ma'am, anong ano natin dyan? If ever nalaman natin, ito, Australia. So taasan pa natin yung...
Ang sa akin is parang, so just that, sorry, kung yung last pala yung sorry.
Para maano yung ano.
Nalesen mo yung stronger.
Kasi...
January nag-accounting China.
Ya terakhir bagus banget. Tata dan
Nagsasayad sa
是ถูกถามแล้วนี่คือซื้อทัสได้
ASEAN China.
เอานี่ครับ
Hindi ba siyang ASEAN?
ASEAN plus 1.
ASEAN global.
ห้องคือซื้อรวมจะ100 บาทเสียงมันแพง
Is Malaysia, Indonesia. It's from ASEAN.
very little. It's like $2.
Seriously?
Really?
Yeah, $2 and 50.
Is that all?
I think you left
No, I did receive an email also. But I wanted.
You've got $2 left. I got $1 left.
Oh, understandable.
Like
spenders. So they are about to top up our next month. Good news. I've been spending my own visa.
You must be out of balance.
1, 2, 1, 2. Yeah, anywhere that feels comfortable, you can even just put it in your pocket. Now, again, I'm sure you're familiar with microphones. These ones in particular are about 5 centimeters from
I didn't receive
So if you look at along right here, if I could, or even just right at the top. And you don't need to
I think if you have
it's close to your
a certain amount, there's a cut for them.
It's obviously as long as it's not
They can how say they can order only
I'm not sure. But I think the visa reimbursement.
skip. Saya dapat itu.
Min juga ya?
Pilihan natin yung tuloy.
And another 100.
Yeah. But I think it's...
Masih.
Test.
It's as loud as it'll go.
Okay. Test. Okay.
Sure, we get out of that. Let's see next week.
Thanks, Ben.
Maybe send to.
ASEAN free trade agreement.
I'm not sure, but you ask them. In our case, maybe not get like a job. You're like to say.
Baka ano po, baka nagkamali po, baka ASEAN China dapat, pero January pa lang sa akin po, just to see the
Can everybody hear me? No? Maybe I'll turn it up a bit. No. How's that?
Perfect.
Yep, great. Okay. Is it okay?
It's okay.
Does everybody, do you like hearing the microphone or is it okay? Better without it? Okay, very good. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your morning tea and caffeinated and ready for another exciting chapter of digital trade. What we're going to do in this afternoon session, or this next session, is we're going to look at what the trade rules actually look like, and then we're going to do a fun exercise. But before we get into that, I thought it might be interesting to reflect on, okay, so we've had a great discussion about why bother, but also what does the evidence show us about the impact that the digital trade rules we already have had. Whoops. So I asked this question in the slide, do digital trade rules increase digital trade? And that's actually, seems like a silly question to ask because of course why would you do, put in place regulations or trade agreements if they didn't do anything? But actually I think a lot of the policy making in this area has been a lot of, best endeavours and best guess about what will work without really having the benefit of years and years of experience with digital trade to understand it. But I'm pleased to say that the good news is that at least the early evidence, so a lot of these rules have really only been in place for maybe 5, 8, 10 years. But the early evidence is that generally they have a positive effect. So there's been quite a lot of work that's looked at, for example, the CPTPP e-commerce chapter, which is probably the oldest modern digital trade rules. So that's from, those rules were actually written in 2015, but let's say 2018 when the agreement was finalised. So since then, there's been quite a bit of evidence to say that there has been more growth in digitally delivered services under those rules than there would otherwise have been. And then a really interesting study that was done in APEC sort of last year and early this year looked at, well, okay, we know agreements as a whole, but what about individual provisions? What effect do they have? Because there have been a lot of even more recent specific provisions that people have started to put into trade agreements. So essentially this study, and you can see the reference there on the slide if you want to have a look, it's freely available. It's very interesting because they tried to break down, well, what impact do different provisions have, and the paper's got a lot more detail. But basically the finding was that for every additional digital trade provision, there's an increase in services, so there's a direct correlation between more provisions, more digital trade. And then the actual increase over a number of years has made a significant difference. So you can see in the case of some types of provision, up to 44% increase in digital trade. But another really significant finding, and I think this is very pertinent to what you all will be going back home to do, the capacity building and the implementation of those rules makes a big difference to how much bang for buck, how much money do they actually deliver to businesses or to governments. So you can't, it's not enough just to do the rules, you also need to implement them and teach people how to use them properly. So I thought we could just take a quick look at what the nature of digital trade rulemaking has been since the earliest days of the kind of the global rule book, the WTO, through to this very modern model of digital agreements, digital economy agreements. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. And let's start with the WTO. Now, can anybody tell me, either because they know or they want to make a guess, which WTO rules apply to digital trade? Agreements or specific provisions? Can anybody think of any WTO rules?
Custom duty or electronic transmission.
Perfect. That's a really big, obvious one, isn't it? The e-commerce moratorium, as it's known. And what were you saying the same? Agreement? Yep, exactly. So there's a whole new WTO plurilateral agreement, not for Bowen membership, isn't there? What else? Do any of the basic WTO agreements apply?
Still debated about digital trade definition, especially for untouchable goods and touchable goods.
Yeah, and you mentioned the GATS? Yeah. So in fact, the whole WTO rulebook does apply to digital trade. Even though, and this is why I've got a picture of this funny old thing, I don't know if probably none of you are as old as I am, but this, when the WTO rulebook, if you like, the Marrakesh Agreement was finalised, this was the height of technology, the fax machine. So, you know, we probably, my children would not even recognise what that is, but that was about as sophisticated as the technology was in those days. But in fact, the crafters of those WTO agreements, shall I just take this off, Suzanne?
Well, I'll just turn it down, Steph.
Okay.
I thought maybe it was just doing feedback. But
yeah. How's that? Better? Still terrible? I was turning that down.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall I just take, is it doing anything? Shall I just take it off? Well, I'll just plough on. Okay, so the authors of that rule book were actually very smart because they designed a set of rules that actually do apply no matter what. So the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, because most digital trade is services trade essentially, that applies. The GATT, so that's the foundation. This is, you know, going back 1947, the really foundational agreement for the whole global trading system. And some of the fundamental WTO principles like non-discrimination, MFN and so on apply. Then we've got some specific agreements, so the Trade Facilitation Agreement, lots and lots of digital in that. The ITA, I don't know if anybody's heard of that. This is the Information Technology Agreement, so that's mostly sort of physical goods in the internet space. But there was also a very famous case, a dispute settlement case against Antigua and Barbuda, or involving Antigua and Barbuda and the United States, about online gambling. We don't need to worry about the details, but in that case, essentially, it was confirmed that the whole WTO rule book still applies whether or not, you know, whichever technology you might be using, it's relevant. But I think has been a general feeling that actually, okay, maybe it applies, but it's not very useful. And so we've seen this huge upsurge in both FTAs and DEAs. Just mention very briefly the e-commerce moratorium, which we've talked about a little bit already. Who's heard of this e-commerce moratorium?
She did.
Show of hands. Yeah, so a few of you. Would anybody like to explain what it is? I mean, it's got a terrible name, the moratorium on the imposition of customs duties on electronic transmissions. I mean, what on earth is it about?
You can't impose like tariffs or duties on the digital information that crosses your border.
Great, thank you, yes. So essentially it's about tariffs on digital trade. Now that phrase, electronic transmissions, I mean, what does that mean? And there's actually a very big debate among WTO members about what exactly that means. Is it the very, the sort of the method of transmission? Is it the content? Is it things that once were physical that are now digital, or is it every digital service? So there's a lot of debate going on about what exactly that means. And why is there that debate? Does anybody know what's going to happen to this moratorium next March at the next WTO Ministerial Conference?
It expires.
Yeah, that's right. Or even more dramatically, the word is going to be terminated. So at the last WTO Ministerial, the members agreed, under strong pressure from India, but also Indonesia in Southeast Asia, of course, and a few other countries, to say, look, we've had enough of this moratorium. We need the ability to start charging tariffs on digital trade, or electronic transmissions, however you might end up defining that. And the reason that some countries have been saying we need to be able to charge tariffs is all of those things that we've already talked about. The potential sort of economic growth opportunity, the tariff revenue opportunity that countries can see is going across their border, that they might have very little visibility but also very little ability to tax. So there's been a big push from some countries to say we're missing out on thousands, millions, billions of dollars worth of tax revenues. We need to be able to put tariffs on. But then on the other side, many other WTO members and lots of economists and think tanks and business organisations argue that, okay, maybe there's a revenue loss here, but in fact, if we step back and look at the economics, the impact of putting tariffs on, you might get a little bit of tariff revenue, but on the other hand, there might be quite a chilling effect on trade and on small businesses being able to utilise digital tools and so on. So there's a very live debate. I have a personal point of view, but don't worry, I'm not going to impose that on you, but there's a lot of stuff that you can read about this if you're interested. It's probably one of the most sort of difficult issues that WTO members are going to have to deal with at this meeting in March, about what do we do? Do we let the moratorium end so countries could potentially put tariffs on? Do we agree to keep it going temporarily or on a permanent basis? So it's going to be a big thing to watch out for next March. And I've just popped on the slide there some of the analysis, which you can easily find if you do a quick search from the OECD about what the actual numbers look like in their analysis. So you can see that there's a significant, there's a sort of a tariff part of it, a revenue part of it, but also there are some quite startling numbers about the impact on trade flows if you started to introduce tariffs. So a very interesting question. Anything anybody would like to ask or add on that? No? Okay. And then I guess in a sort of more slightly less contentious frame, we've got this new e-commerce agreement that we've already mentioned. So this involves quite a lot of WTO members. It started off with a smaller group, and then at its peak got up to 91 participants. About 80 of them have sort of signed up to this new agreement that has been finalised last July. Now, the content of the agreement has been finalised, but there's a big debate going on now about, okay, what happens next? Do those members just implement it? Does it get integrated into the WTO rulebook? This sort of technicality there about, is it an Annex 4 agreement? Does it just stand outside the WTO? So again, a lot of discussion going on about that. It's not a perfect agreement by any means. So it doesn't include some of the key things that you'd want to see in a digital trade agreement, particularly around data flows. There's just nothing in it because it was too politically contentious. But, it's a really important start in building a sort of more coherent global rule book, that idea of straightening out the noodle bowl that we talked about earlier. So let's then move away from the WTO into the main sort of vehicle for digital trade policy making, which has come through free trade agreements and also digital economy agreements. So since 2000, increasingly over time, now about half of FTAs have got at least some digital provision, and about a third of them have e-commerce chapters or digital trade chapters. And over time, we've seen those agreements becoming wider and deeper. So particularly into the most recent version, the digital economy agreements, they've got much, much more scope, sort of deeper and a bigger number of issues than the earlier models. And in broad brush terms, we can see digital trade policy making could kind of have three major templates. Now, things are changing quite a bit, and particularly now with digital economy agreements, but this way of thinking about it, I think, is quite a useful sort of theoretical model anyway. So you can read lots of articles that scholars have written about these three digital realms or digital empires in very sort of crude terms: the US model, the China model, or the Brussels model. So the CPTPP and RCEP, so obviously RCEP, the ASEAN-led big mega regional agreement, it's called the China model, I guess, because it includes China. China is a member of RCEP, and I think the perception is that it has driven a lot of the digital rules in that agreement. But basically, on the face of them, CPTPP and RCEP are very similar looking. They have this sort of general default of, well, data should flow freely, we shouldn't have forced data localisation, we recognise there's sovereignty, but basically, economically, it doesn't make sense to sort of restrict data flows. But there's some very important differences. So where the CPTPP model says any exceptions to this sort of general openness should be very limited. So we should only have very restricted exceptions and only where there's a legitimate public policy reason. In RCEP, it says, well, actually, countries need more policy space than that. They need a much broader and in some cases self-judging exceptions. So this language about it's got to only be for legitimate reasons is not in RCEP. It's particularly when it comes to national security, it says the RCEP member themselves is the judge of what's valid here. So that's a lot more scope, either for, depending on your perspective, either for policy space or protectionism, whereas this is a lot less scope for that. And then we've got the EU model, which until recently was really grounded in one big EU regulation, which you might have heard of, GDPR. Who's heard of that? Okay, well, those annoying cookies that we talked about earlier, GDPR. Everything that the EU has done is grounded in this idea that privacy is a fundamental human right, and it it governs anything that might be to do with digital trade. So my privacy is more important than your ability to make money or what big tech wants to do or anything else. And so until recently, it didn't even have any sort of rules around data flows or whatever in its trade agreements, because it was like, well, this is sacrosanct privacy. But recently it's actually started to move a little bit more in the direction of these other two models, and we'll come back to that a bit later on. So let's now turn to this new model of digital trade policy making, which is very much born in ASEAN or in the sort of broader Asia Pacific region. So digital economy agreements. And I do a lot of work with APEC, so I like to think of it as sort of an APEC thing, but really a lot of it has been led out of Southeast Asia. it's this model where essentially recognising that, okay, we've had the WTO, not really good enough, we've got FTAs, maybe not really going far enough. We need a new way of thinking about digital trade and writing the rules for digital trade, which is these new digital economy agreements. And so many of the most interesting and sort of dynamic ways of writing the rules of the road for the digital economy have come out of your region. But now, interestingly, even though many of the countries that are involved in these tend to be small or middle-sized countries, they've had a lot of influence. So we're now starting to see, the same model being used by other countries not part of the region, so the UK and even now the EU and other European countries, the UAE is starting to use that model as well, and a number of Latin American countries. So go ASEAN, lots of really important influence happening there. And just to sort of put the nuts and bolts down, we've had in this sort of landscape a whole lot of regional FTAs which have started to build out this new model. So New Zealand, Singapore from back in 2000, and then a number of other big milestones, CPTPP and RCEP, but also ANZFTA, the ASEAN Australia New Zealand Agreement and the upgrade, have now been superseded by these digital economy agreements, many of them led by Singapore, but also within ASEAN. And of course, your own digital economy framework agreement is probably going to be, I would say, the most sort of cutting edge of all. And that has been, you probably are all aware, substantially concluded with the final details to be wrapped up next year. But even from the EU, who, remember I said, didn't even really have digital trade rules until quite recently, is now starting to use this model as well. And then within FTAs, you can also see a number of these sort of DEA style provisions. So New Zealand has done an agreement with the UK that looks a lot like it, and so has Australia. This latest sort of cab off the rank called FitP is going to have some of those agreements. So you can see there's this sort of big evolution into more creative and more detailed trade rules over time. And so these are digital-only agreements which have a very interesting structure. So normally in FTAs, they're very comprehensive. They've got lots of different chapters about goods or services or investment, intellectual property, customs, all sorts of things. In digital economy agreements, they tend to be more modular and thematic. So there might be a module on, for instance, digital identities or innovation. They tend to have very broad scope, so they have lots and lots of topics in them. But the commitment levels, unlike a traditional FTA, which is usually hard law, legally binding, you sign up and then you're held accountable, most of these agreements have only got best endeavours or cooperation principles. So they're not really about a set of enforceable rules as much as they are about setting up a conversation about digital trade. Why do you think that might be? Why would they move away from binding law into this more kind of cooperative, conversational style of agreement? I want you to take just a minute or two at your tables to have a chat about why you think that might be. So just 1 minute discussing at each of your tables why digital economy agreements don't have lots of binding rules but have lots of cooperation. So you talk to each other at your tables about that.
There is no application
Security and data sovereignty.
I don't think that
Sectors.
Strict commitment about it.
Cooperation is better than non-cooperation.
Around this kind of new
Otherwise, you have to rules and regs, domestic rules.
National security.
I think that
Sovereign and protection.
most provisions were
And that's in the
Okay. There's some great ideas floating around. Who would like to share why these agreements are generally cooperative rather than hard law?
Malaysia.
Gentlemen, our discussion, we think the most critical issue why becoming more cooperation instead of binding of national interest, national security, including data sovereignty, data protection, and then we feel that data is a new oil. So everybody want to protect critical data.
Okay, so too important and too sensitive to make binding commitments. Is that great? Other ideas?
Cooperation is better than commitment. Otherwise, you have to amend rules and regulation, domestic rules and regulations. So cooperation is going to be better together, or members to participate, and you do not need to amend domestic rules and regulations.
Okay, great. So you come together, you talk about how to work together, but you don't have to make lots of politically painful changes. Love it. Other ideas?
So I would say that the digital economy is still too much of a frontier economy, too much of a black box, and a lot of the legal frameworks in many different countries haven't caught up to the constantly new developments are coming out all the time. So
spot on, exactly.
We just need a lot of time. We just need more time to try to.
That's exactly right. When you see something like generative AI that's gone from absolutely nothing to now completely ubiquitous in the space of a couple of years, how on earth would you design a good regulation that takes into account all the economic, legal, commercial, societal impacts in a sort of really robust way? So I think all of those answers are great. I mean, there's a lot about how countries write good rules in the digital economy that we are still learning, and I think this is a very interesting way of essentially everybody's learning together and coming together to design good rules. And I think it's a very ASEAN way of working, that you can start with a conversation and sort of cooperation and soft norms, and then over time maybe you're ready to write hard law and put in binding commitments, but not yet. So I think that's great. So what's in these agreements? Well, I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially you could think of it as having 5 kind of main pillars. The first one is about agility. So as we just discussed, this is all changing so fast. Who knows how to deal with it? If you've been involved in FTA negotiations, that can sometimes take literally years, maybe 10 years or even longer to go from start to finish. Well, that, goodness knows what will happen in the digital economy in another 10 years. So a lot of these sort of provisions are very agile. So the structure, the way new issues can be added, the idea that these are living agreements that will change over time is baked into them because of the nature of the digital economy. They're also about enabling end-to-end digital transactions. So those older rules in FTAs were about, data flow, we know that's important. And then there was a bit about trade facilitation, like maybe let's use paperless trade, but that was about it. But these newer agreements say, well, actually, if we really want to do digital trade, it's not enough just to do data and paperless trade. There's so much more that goes into it, whether it's about, the tools like e-invoicing or e-payments or, how systems can be interoperable. How do we make your system work with my system? Do we need a regulatory sandbox or an API? And what are the standards we're using? So very much the idea that we need to make the whole transaction work. Trust is absolutely critical for governments, for businesses, for individuals. And so a lot of these agreements recognise that and build in mechanisms to support trust. So things like, provisions on consumer protection or trust marks. Some of the newer ones even have provisions about, well, let's cooperate to make sure that the online environment is safe. We're not going to get out there, and we were just chatting before about, should kids be using social media or disinformation? How do we deal with all of those in a cross-border sense? And then another really important sort of related part is around, well, how do we make sure everybody benefits from digital trade? Because it has this incredible potential that we could lift small businesses, it's now 12 p.m, we could lift small businesses, up, we could lift women or Indigenous groups or whatever out of poverty, we could give them opportunities, but if they are not able to participate, that opportunity is lost. And then there's a lot about innovation, so, ChatGPT, quantum, whatever might be coming, we need to write the rules in a way that will actually be flexible enough to deal with that. So those are the key elements. So what might be some of the benefits and what might be some of the disadvantages of this model? I want you to spend a minute or two at your tables just talking about, give me a couple of benefits and a couple of drawbacks. Okay, so talk amongst yourselves. Yeah, sure.
Given the different countries have different domestic constraint or different domestic capacity to adopt the digital economy or service trade, should the country strengthen their domestic capacity first before adopting certain rule or regulation or participate in certain trade agreement? Or should they participate in certain trade agreement and adopt certain regulation before strengthening their capacity? And is there any countries specifically you can give example on the implications of scenario?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and in fact a little later on I've got some slides that talk about that, because it's a real world problem, isn't it? I mean, if you might not have, I don't know, a domestic electronic transactions framework regulation, should you be trying to negotiate a digital trade agreement? Because maybe you should do that first. It's a very good question. My personal view is a bit of both. So I think to come to the table in a process negotiating a digital economy agreement, you probably would want to have at least some of those basic building blocks already there. But equally, I think one of the most exciting things about this model is that countries can actually use it to upskill, because so much of it's cooperative. I mean, okay, maybe you've got a privacy regulation, but you don't know what to do about AI, it's just too difficult. Well, what you can do is join in this setting as the forum to actually learn from your partners about, well, how have they dealt with AI? Have they made changes to their privacy regulation or their consumer protection regulation, or have they done a whole new AI Act? So I actually think this can be like a vehicle for capacity building, and in fact some of the digital economy agreements do explicitly include capacity building, sort of stakeholder engagement, expert input as part of the model, recognising that this is, I mean, we're all, that terrible saying, we're building the plane as we're flying it. So we're all learning together and putting in place what we need to navigate the digital world by learning from others, and kind of also there's a really important other element to that, which is if you're at the point of being close to being able to regulate something, but maybe you don't necessarily have the legislation on the books yet, if you are in a conversation with your trading partners or places that are going to be an important market for your businesses, for example, it's actually very useful to understand what they're doing, so that when you're designing your regulation, it can be with an eye to interoperability. Because one of the big problems in that noodle bowl is everybody's come up with their own ideas, and this happens within each economy too. Individual agencies might come up with a way of regulating one thing, which might be great, but if it doesn't work in with other parts of the digital economy or what your trading partner's doing, the potential benefits are going to be less because there's just going to be friction that you create where it's more expensive or more difficult, or you've got to do more paperwork to actually use the sort of cross-border part. So I think it's a fantastic question, and I personally actually really believe that participating in this model of trade policy is a really good, benefit for your own self in designing your own domestic regulations. I did some work a couple of years ago for the Asian Development Bank about aid for trade. So one of the really many development donors and institutes have put a lot of effort into digital infrastructure, so putting in broadband or satellite or whatever. All of that is extremely important, but a lot of them haven't put in place the regulatory building blocks that countries might need. So this work I did for the Asian Development Bank was saying, what's the sort of the minimum viable regulation that you would need to be able to participate and protect yourself? Because there's also a risk if you don't have things like cybersecurity legislation. Maybe you're exposing your consumers to real risk. So I think there's a very important part of that work that digital economy agreements can deliver. So thanks for that great question. Let's just spend a minute at our tables talking about what are some of the benefits and what are some of the drawbacks. And one benefit might be building capacity. So just spend a couple of minutes talking to your neighbours about what the benefits might be or what some of the disadvantages might be.
Think of one about this kind of statements by the framework of a good ecosystem, especially in startups, entrepreneurs, like only look for those kind of startups. Only about the domestic market, but they would also think about put access to a range of customers without trying to navigate the legal frameworks and something that's wrong with the DEA. Create this kind of both ecosystem and
but sometimes the infrastructure still play a role,
especially for like I think like she mentioned like and also indigenous peoples and from this kind of trade they can use larger trade ideas of projects that they solve
barriers to entry.
More customer recognition.
Okay, everybody. Have we got a couple of ideas of benefits? What are some of the advantages of the digital economy agreement? Any benefits from using this model? Go ahead.
Give it a try. I think one of the benefits of these central economy arrangements, I would think specifically for the startups, especially.
Yeah.
This kind of arrangement would provide a very good ecosystem or quite good access to a wide range of customers for especially startup companies, and also for, I think one of the slides you mentioned about inclusion, right? So certain area that women or indigenous community difficulty to access certain markets, especially within the small community.
Yeah.
With this kind of arrangement, would provide certain, like you mentioned, the capacity building or aid for trade, so they can access this kind of training and incubate their business concepts, and then they can sell these products and also think about, they don't have to think about regulations to navigate, especially like tariff or something like that. So I think this is one of the benefits that
Love it. So a really powerful sort of inclusion and development story from this kind of model. Any other ideas? Yeah.
I think the benefit is for everyone to exercise involved in this process.
Yeah.
The drawbacks are actually for least developed countries or developing countries sometimes very hard to cut the exercise. What I mean is, for instance, you need infrastructure. You need to teach people, especially like Timor-Leste, for instance.
Yeah.
We should educate people to involve, and I think this is like huge.
So you mean it would be good, but you just not even at the starting line, essentially, for participating. Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. Any other advantages or drawbacks? And then I'll tell you what I had put on the slide. Okay, so oops. So some of the advantages I thought were, the fact is, if you don't have many binding commitments, you can actually be very creative and come up with good, solid, evidence-based approaches. The benefits, de facto MFN benefits, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, if you learn through a DEA a good way to regulate, let's say AI, then if you put in place that regulation, all of your trading partners essentially get the benefit of that, because generally we regulate in the services space in a way that applies to everybody. It's not specific to a particular trading partner. They can be a building block to broader coherence, and they can, definitely grow in size. So one of the great agreements that's out there that has this potential is called the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, so DEPA, not DEFA. And that started with 3 members, Singapore, but also New Zealand and Chile. And then Korea has joined, and now there are half a dozen other countries that also want to join. So we can see over time, hopefully it will grow and grow and grow until everybody, it's the party that everybody wants to join. But equally, the fact that there aren't many binding rules means that you could inadvertently create more friction. So people might generally have the same ideas, but the way that they actually design their regulations or whatever might actually still cause businesses to have more compliance costs. There's no market access, there might be lots and lots of them, and then as we've talked about, it might be really hard for countries that may not necessarily have a good sort of foundation of regulation or capacity or infrastructure to actually take part. And we've already talked about this thanks to the great question from the room, but basically developing countries can potentially use these agreements as a vehicle for actually upskilling themselves, but also if you probably need to have a sort of minimum viable MVP, as they say in the digital space. You need the minimum viable sort of capacity to actually be able to participate meaningfully. So we're going to go now into an exercise. I won't sort of dwell on this, but just suffice it to say we're going to look at, for you as ASEAN officials, either for your own economy, your own country, or for the region, we're going to start to look at, okay, we'll bring all these threads together. What do we do now? So this slide, I'll leave you to sort of read that in your own time, but suffice it to say, ASEAN, amazingly dynamic, world leading in lots of these areas, huge growth potential. And no wonder then, as well as being an innovator in digital technologies, it's an innovator in policy making. And so it's got this amazing agreement that's very close to finalisation, the Digital Economy Framework Agreement. Who's heard of it or done any work on DEFA? Just a quick show of hands. A few of you, yep. So it's a bit like DEPA, but it's the ASEAN version of it. It's got 9 core negotiating elements, which, sorry, you may not be able to read on this tiny little slide. I'll just quickly tell you what they are. Cross-border data flows, so as we know, that data governance is a critical element. Online safety and cybersecurity, talent mobility and cooperation. This is a very interesting one. There are no other digital economy agreements that have the movement of people in them, but this is really recognises the sort of ASEAN talent pool and being able to tap into that is a really, if you talk to any tech company, you say, what's your biggest headache? They'll usually say, oh, talent. I can't get the people I need to do my AI or whatever it might be. Cooperation on emerging topics, so all those innovative technologies. Competition policy, should we let, big US tech companies dominate, or, how do we make sure that the playing field's level? Digital ID and authentication, digital payments, e-invoicing, cross-border e-commerce, digital trade. So there are lots and lots of those things that we've already talked about that are in there. And it's hopefully going to be an incredibly powerful as a model for the rest of the world, but also for economic growth. So at the moment, ASEAN's digital economy is forecast to be $1 trillion in 2030, but a study that was done on DEFA said that could double. So it could be worth $2 trillion if you can get all these policy settings right. And just to look at what's in there, this is, sort of looking at what the existing provisions are in digital trade agreements. You may not be able to read them from where you're sitting, but, ranging from things like data governance to digital ID to fintech to submarine cables to standards, all sorts of things. And DEFA is likely to include a lot of those, although not all of them. But until we see the text, probably not really very easy to be sure. And so knowing all of that, what I would like you now to do, either at your tables or maybe the mega table up the back, you could break into two groups. So I want you to think, okay, your trade minister has asked you for a new digital strategy. I want you to think about what are the goals of the strategy, what are you actually trying to achieve? And you might want to think about, is it about economic growth? Is it about helping startups and small businesses? Is it about protecting, kids on the internet? Do you have targets? And also, what are some actions you might want to take, short term and longer term? So some of these things you might think are really important, but they're going to take a few years to achieve. Other things you might be able to do more quickly. So let's spend sort of 8 minutes talking at your tables, and I want, if you can, come up with a couple of goals or one goal, and then a few actions that you might take. And this can either be for ASEAN or for your own, one economy, let's say, your own economy or a theoretical economy, what is most important. Okay, is everybody clear on what you're doing? Great. Okay, well, I'm really excited to hear what you come up with, so please get started.
Shopping spree, or you can withdraw the cash, but it has got to get out of your account today. Alright? Yes. They cannot put more in unless you've withdrawn everything they gave you in the first payment.
Everything. We have $7.
Ronald, and a very warm welcome to our research associates at the Public Policy Institute. Catherine has kindly agreed to join us today to talk about stakeholder engagement. So thank you, Catherine, and welcome, and I will hand over to you. And then whatever you need, just let me know.
Thanks. Kia ora, Suze. Good afternoon, everybody. Now I'm on Haumai. My name's Catherine, and I'm going to be with you for a few sessions in the next week or so. So today's our first one, where we're going to be talking about stakeholder engagement issues, and we're going to make it as interactive as possible, actually. So I'm not going to be doing too much of the talking today. I'm going to get you guys to get out of your seats and get involved in an activity for most of this session. And then I will be back with you later in the week to talk about trade data with Mohammed, and next week we'll be looking at the future of trade issues as well. So perhaps just to give a little bit of my background, because I don't think I've met you before. I was at ATEPS last week, but didn't get a chance to talk to many people. I have a background in international trade. I started my career working for the New Zealand government, as I'm sure a lot of the other people you've been having sessions with are my former colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I worked for MFAT in the trade area, was posted at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and then my final posting was as Deputy High Commissioner for New Zealand in South Africa. And that's where I stayed for a while. So I worked then on international trade and development issues in the African context for many years. I have been back in New Zealand for about 4 years now, working on supporting the implementation of the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement for a large part of that time. I also work with MFAT still on some of their development projects, and I'm in the process of slowly starting a PhD on international trade with the PPI. So I've had a very mixed sort of background. I've done a lot of capacity building work with your colleagues in many different parts of the world, the Pacific Islands, Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, and also some online groups from ASEAN too. But it's exciting to be here in person because it means we can actually interact. I'm very happy if you want to stop me at any point to ask questions or to make comments or to provide examples. So please don't be shy as we go through the short presentation I'm going to make at the beginning. And then, as I said, we're going to move into a group activity, where I'm going to ask you to do a bit of role playing today. You're going to put on your acting hats and you're going to put yourselves into the shoes of different stakeholders. So we're talking today about stakeholder engagement, which is a really critical part of trade policy. It tends to happen at different points in the policy cycle. So you may engage with your stakeholder communities like business, civil society, workers, farmers, NGOs. You may engage with them when you're first kind of trying to get an idea of what your trade policy might look like. So in that design phase, at the start of perhaps negotiations with another country. But then you might also engage with them at the end when you're actually implementing policy and you encounter problems. And you'll have a company ringing you up or contacting your ministry or your export or investment promotion agencies and saying, what do we do with this? What's the tariff on this good? Why is my container stuck at this port? Or how do I get the product I produced recognised in this market? Why can I not sell it there? So you've got stakeholder engagement happening right along the whole chain. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but with a specific focus on the business community and private sector, which tends to be the biggest and most loud and important of the stakeholder groups when it comes to trade and economic activities. So there's a multi-level way to think about stakeholder engagement, as there is with most issues in the trade policy environment, where you can think about your domestic stakeholders, your gatherings of domestic stakeholders, where do they come together, how do you actually talk to each other, the platforms that you have to do that. That might also happen at a regional level as well, which is very common. And then, of course, we've got it happening multilaterally as well in organisations like the World Trade Organization, but even things like the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF will have stakeholder engagements as an important part of the discussions happening about finance issues. We've had the G20 happening just this last week in South Africa, and you might have noticed that there's all sorts of different levels of stakeholders around the G20 as well. Did anyone notice any of the stakeholder groups that were active in the margins of the G20? They normally have a letter and a 20. So they're very much like the G20, but it's just a different letter and the 20. Did anyone pick up any of them?
Also?
Yeah, the B20, right? Yeah, so the business groupings. So we had the B20, Anything else? They made a statement, they made a presentation, they made input into the discussions. There was also a thing called the T20. Anyone know what the T20 might be?
Think tank.
Yep, think tanks, exactly. So that's another group of stakeholders that are quite important in these discussions, think tanks. And in the case of the T20, that can be universities, it can be think tanks, it can be research councils, organisations that tend to look at these issues. There was also work being done by organised labour. They don't tend to operate at the level of the G20, but they released a statement from the international umbrella organisations of trade unions about those issues. You had other groups happening in that space as well, like you had development finance institutions and banks coming together to make statements about things like debt relief, those kind of aspects of the G20 discussion. Sometimes you also have a group that I kind of quite like to call celebrity diplomacy actors, right? So high profile individuals or super wealthy individuals who tend to get involved sometimes in these conversations as well. So in the past, we've had people like Bill Gates, for example, Warren Buffett. You might have Elon Musk participating in some of these conversations in a very interesting way these days. But then you also have people like, I don't know, George Clooney, Emma Watson, those kind of celebrities who will be used to drive home a particular message. So you've got all sorts of stakeholders clustered around these issues. Have any of you been involved in consultations either at a country or a regional level with stakeholders? Yeah? How does that work in your country? Sorry, and you'll have to tell me where you're from.
Yes, I'm from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I go the consultations as ASEAN with the business council.
Yep.
So normally, because we have a mechanism like because I'm the member of the coordinating committee to implement the ASEAN. So normally we have a mechanism to consult with the ASEAN Business Council to listen about their concerns over the non-tariff measures.
Right.
Yes, as well as like what they want to see in the future. For example, if we are upgrading some agreement that is have a very high impact on the business in the region. So they want to, we want to hear from their perspective what elements they want to put in the agreement.
Yep.
Yes.
So you get their inputs into your positions before you negotiate, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. And it's effective? What's your view?
Yes, I think that normally the business council they always try to have more ambitious things because they also contains a lot of big enterprises. Yes, but of course from the government perspective, we want to balance the balance outcomes.
Yeah.
So of course we will try to have conversation with the government ASEAN to see what we can do because normally the things that business council wants always very ambitious.
Right.
Yes, but we need to see what we will achieve as a government.
Yeah. No, they're very good points. And it brings me to the point that not all stakeholders are the same, right? And they're not homogeneous groups, even when we talk about business and the business council. As you said, sometimes there's the big companies, the very big companies, multinational corporations. But we all know that the majority of our actual private sector, which is the profit-making part of our economy, tends to be small and medium-sized enterprises, or even micro enterprises in some instances. And so understanding who that particular stakeholder group is, knowing who's in your private sector, what their different views are, is actually quite important and can be challenging, because those structures we have that were just outlined there tend to bring in certain types of people to the conversation, but not always a representative voice of our stakeholder groups. So the private sector is the profit-making part of our economy, as I said. That can be a bit of a blurred line when we come to things like state-owned enterprises. That's been quite a controversial point, particularly for economies like China, for example. Are some of the actors in the Chinese economy really private sector, or are they in fact state-sponsored corporates? So we do have a bit of a line, but they are very much still a really important part of the work of trade policy, because it's said again and again and again that governments make the rules, but the actual trade is done by the private sector. So that's why it tends to matter. And size does count when it's time to really be thinking about your private sector and understanding it. And this is for a number of reasons, because, as I said, SMEs are very much fundamental in the economies, I would say, of all of our countries, right? Even in New Zealand. The small and medium-sized actors are really the backbone of our private sector. They, however, are very difficult to organise and to consult with about policy issues. And there's a few reasons why that's the case. That's because it's an incredibly diverse group. It may range from sort of informal people trading their products. It may range from an e-commerce entrepreneur who's just put up a website and is, basically on selling things made by other people. It may range to medium-sized companies that employ 100 people, but are still not in that large category. And so consulting and engaging with SMEs is an ongoing challenge, I think, I've never encountered a model actually that works anywhere in the world, to tell you the truth, particularly well. What we tend to find easier is to talk to larger private sector actors. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they tend to be the ones that export more. They tend to be the ones involved in trade issues. So if we're talking about trade policy or investment issues, the larger companies are really your audience in most instances anyway, because they are much more likely also to engage and want to influence the policy space in that way that was described by our colleague from Vietnam. That they are the ones that want to come in and put their issues on the table and their requests and have a conversation about the trade agreements being negotiated, because they have the capacity to do so often in terms of they tend to be the ones that are going to be part of the conversations a lot more easily. Has anyone had any experience of trying to consult or talk to SMEs? Does anyone here focus on the issues of small enterprises? Yes? No? Nobody? Yeah?
Actually, I'm working with Quality and Standard Department in Timor-Leste.
Yes.
We are talking more specifically focused on conformity assessment and standard development in the country.
Yeah.
So the reason is normally we talk to SMEs how they can actually adapt to regional regulation, or harmonizing their harmonizing regulation and actually talk to them. We call it socializing in here. I think consultation with SMEs, just to ensure that actually they are aware of the requirement, also the process, especially when you're involved in digital trade or accessing broader market or transferring your product overseas. Like that's normally we consult with them, and actually they focus more on Chamber of Commerce, then goes further to SMEs.
Okay, so you tend to work through a Chamber of Commerce. Yeah, that's a really important way that we can think about private sector consultations, is those associations that do play a really critical role in a number of different ways. They play a role, I think, in terms of information flow. So the Chambers of Commerce can help you as government people to get information out to a wider set of operators more easily than having to go individually, as you say, to each firm. You can use a Chamber of Commerce or a business association. It's also a way for the information to come from the business community up towards government policymakers as well, because the Chamber of Commerce can play a role in facilitating exchanges, putting together positions, coming up with ideas that they present to you then collectively. And so it's a two-way sort of flow, I think, that's really important about information around a whole range of issues. Obviously, Chambers of Commerce also tend to provide a range of other services that you'll be well aware of, like training and standards, for example. They may do certificates of origin. They may do due diligence or checking of partners in different markets. They may have networking events and so on, golf days.
Yep. I just want to add another point. So I'm from Indonesia, and our minister, he has a priority program called Gaspol. It means that every Thursday we need to wear everything from local products, especially from SMEs, and also
every Thursday.
Every Thursday.
Right.
Yeah,
something different every Thursday, or you can wear the same thing every Thursday?
Even we make a campaign, we need to identify like each part of our clothes, or watch or shoes must be local branded, and it will be promoted in our social media.
Nice.
And also we have also like annual trade expo exhibition, which our attaché and promotion center in abroad must bring buyers to Indonesia to buy products specifically from the MSMEs.
Excellent, yeah.
So we really have concern and priority matters regarding MSMEs.
Yeah, I love the Wear Local Thursdays. I mean, that's great. I mean, that's a really practical way to do it. Is it challenging? Do you find it hard?
No, it's not challenging.
No, you've got enough range of choices, and people have got enthusiastic about it? Yeah, excellent. So these are creative, that's great. These are creative ways that you can communicate and get involved with your SME sector. Because as I said, it's not always straightforward to help the smaller players in many respects. So creative ways to understand and represent the needs of them, they're really good examples. Trade shows and trade expos are very good, traditional. If any of you have ever been to the big ones in China, like the Chinese expos and so on, I mean, they're incredible spaces to visit one day, just to kind of get that sense of the type of activities happening in the trade space and the linkages that can be made. But there's also much smaller ones. So these are some of the sort of questions that I challenge you to think about, and we're going to be talking about data later in this week. So I wanted to just put this up here. And that is, do you actually know your business community? Do you actually know who's in your private sector, whether they are all small players or whether they're big players? Do we know who is interested in exporting, or perhaps who is in the supply chain of larger multinational corporations? So they're exporting indirectly, even if they don't think they're exporting specifically. And how can you fill these data gaps? How can you then facilitate that engagement? Does anyone have access or has looked at data that tells them about their private sector? Is anyone here from a customs background? Yes.
We have the, what do you call it, import-export data that's online, and you can just go to the customs website for it.
Yes. Have you looked at it, Evad, or is it accessible in a way that could tell you stories about your business community, or is it more about just the overall trends and
I think more or less you can work using the data. Like recently I was looking at the data and just checking as to like the valuation of how much of the import trade is like de minimis, so small parcels.
Right. That's
compared
good.
to like the bigger valued. So the small parcels tend to be for either consumer or it's the SM and the small medium enterprises who utilize that particular channel. So
excellent.
The data's there.
Yeah.
It does require some knowledge as well, and like how do you extract the information that you need or to make the conclusion that you need.
Yeah, 100%. It always does, And but that's great. That's a good example. Understanding your de minimis trade. It's become a lot more important these days with tariffs coming back into full fashion again. Understanding what's de minimis and what's not is really critical. So, and that can tell you a lot about the engagement of smaller players or direct business to consumer operations that might be happening. So the data is generally all there, to tell you the truth, in different ways and forms. But often what I think we don't do enough of is really look at this and try to unpack and understand the types of patterns we have. The World Bank used to do a great job of this, actually. They used to do some really excellent exporter profiling across a range of countries around the world, where they would look at going deep into understanding the types of firms and actors that were involved in trade. But unfortunately, they don't do that so much anymore. But it's a great project to have PhD students or even master's students kind of work on these things if you ever get a chance to do it. And I'll show you some examples of how to work with this type of data to understand the private sector when we come to that on Thursday as well. But I just very much encourage you to get to know your private sector, especially if you're in smaller countries. I know the size of your countries varies hugely in this room, but if you're in some of the smaller countries, it can be a little bit easier to really start to understand who are the key actors that are engaging in trade and what are their needs and requirements. And it can make stakeholder consultations much easier. So we were talking a little bit about business associations and the importance of them, because we want to be able to engage with a collective rather than individual firms. That helps us to avoid the capture of debates by the limited interests of maybe just one or two actors. So it helps to ward off ideas about corruption and so on, and distortion of policy in favour of particular economic interests. So the idea is to have these more neutral collective groupings of private sector actors who can, as I said, provide filters for information. They can translate policy into commercial speak. This can be really critical in some areas like trade and services, right? Where commercially the four modes of liberalisation of the services world of the WTO makes very little sense to most business people, especially if they've never sort of encountered those conversations before. So you can have business associations and business groupings that can be really helpful in almost a translation function between policy speak and business speak. And they can also supplement firms, especially smaller operators who may not actually have technical capacity to look at legislation or regulations or changes going on in the world that have implications. Anyone worked with or worked for a business association before? No? Worked with. What would be some of their challenges, do you think?
Actually, I talk about Timor-Leste.
Yeah.
We are a small country and we are in the process of developing our country. So forming an association is really helpful in terms of, as you said, like identify their needs. So for instance, in Timor-Leste, we have Chamber of Commerce, and we also have a Women Enterprise Association. And we also have Trade Invest, which actually collect all the data about companies that actually able to export, and also another institutions that actually having like transforming startup to real business. And also I think that there are lots of some of association that actually organize private sector and involve them in some many activities. Right now, like we have business association between Australia and Timor-Leste.
Yes. Yep.
Every year, actually, we have a business forum in Timor-Leste, and I think they involved many companies that in this business forum, and are actually right now they also collaborating with business partners in Timor-Leste and Australia just to ensure that we can collaborate together. That's something that
You've given lots of great examples there of the different types of associations that we find in our countries. Even a country like Timor-Leste is smaller, but even in the larger ones, you'll find very similar groupings. You'll have groupings that represent sectors. So you're going to have probably manufacturers of some kind or industrialists. You're going to have farmers or agricultural organisations. You might have groups of digital commerce or e-commerce actors who follow the digital space. You will have professional associations for all the services. So you'll have your professional groups of accountants, lawyers, architects. All of the services will have their own groups of sorts as well, professional bodies. And then you'll have groups that are maybe more issue-oriented, or more characteristics such as women, coming together to deal with the issues of women and entrepreneurs, or young people maybe will have some kind of association in many places as well. Startups, as you mentioned. So there's going to be a wide sort of range of associations that help organise your private sector. And if we map those in most countries, you find there's an awful lot. And there'll be overlap in membership, overlap in interest, overlap in engagement, and often they'll funnel up to be covered by some sort of broad umbrella of a type that tends to be the one that government will go to first. So does anybody have a kind of a broad collective of business that sits at a very high level in their country? We have Business New Zealand, right? So they sort of sit at that level that sits above all the sector associations, the professional bodies, and is the one that focuses on the big picture issues of how's the economy going, what's our overall approach to immigration issues, at a very sort of big picture type of discourse. Can you think in your own countries of the equivalent? Yeah?
In Cambodia, we have this high-level platform we call Government Private Sector Forum.
Yeah.
So representing from the private sector side, we have the Cambodia Chamber of Commerce. They are the government partner that gather a wide range of the business sectors. So within this kind of GPSF mechanism, we have 16 working groups.
Okay, that's busy. Yeah.
Cross-cutting issues from like agriculture, manufacturing, banking, non-banking services, and so on.
Do you have a trade working group, or does trade kind of cut across?
Like export promotion working.
Okay, an export promotion working group. Okay, great. So that's a good example there from Cambodia. They've structured a government to private sector forum with all the different working groups underneath. So I'm sure you can all think of the examples hopefully in your own context, and I'm sure some of you will have to work with those groups at different points in your career, whether it's either through negotiations or maybe just policy development or shifts going on, or simply to get a better understanding of what your economy's doing and where it might be going in the future. And business does have an interest, and I mean, quite frankly, it's got even more of an interest these days in conversations around trade policy than ever before, I think, because of the opportunities that are presented, but also the threats increasingly to the international global economy and the stability of it. So you have very much a motivation right now for the private sector to be involved in consultations, to be part of these stakeholder discussions. And so I think it's an incredibly important time to be thinking about these issues. So we've talked quite a lot about these questions about the types of stakeholders involved, and I want to give us plenty of time to do a wee exercise today. So as I said, we're going to do a bit of a role play just to kind of get you out of your comfort zones a little bit, but also to get you thinking from the perspective of different stakeholders. So the format I've chosen to do this in is a talk show. Okay? So we're going to have you guys present a talk show. What? Talking about US-ASEAN trade agreements, right? Very topical, okay? So the topic today of the ASEAN economy today, I've called it up here. You can come up with your own name if you're a host of the talk show. You can absolutely rename it. But I want you to have a conversation with a panel about US-ASEAN trade relations, whether that be the latest agreements that some of your countries have put in place, whether that be the dynamics around the region's cooperation. We're going to have a conversation representative of the different views of various stakeholders. Okay, are you with me? So this is going to require you to think not in policy speak. Okay? So part of this is also an exercise just in communication about trade. Because, as I said, if you go into talk to a business person or you go in to talk to an environmental NGO group and you come with a whole lot of technical jargon, acronyms, words that make very little sense in a normal conversation, you're going to lose your audience very quickly, right? And you maybe even just end up talking completely across purposes and not getting any value out of the conversation. So today I want you to try and really think about trade issues as if you're talking to your cousin or your neighbour who has no idea what your job is, right? And but you've got to try and explain it in easy to manage language. So we're going to do that. And one way to do that is to tell stories. So if I'm to talk to you, any of you involved in communicating with the media or on social media even about trade in your countries? No? None of you have to give speeches or... No? Okay, so this is going to be a good test for you today. You're going to have to think about this, because one day when you get promoted to those senior roles in your ministry, you're going to have to know how to do this, okay? So it's a communications course today as well as a trade course. So I want to see lively engagement and participation from the audience. So the way we're going to structure this is I've got I think this is from Cambodia. My sister gave this to me when she came back from her trip down the Mekong recently. And so I've put in here these roles. You're all going to just grab a little piece of paper and be assigned a role. So obviously we're quite a big group today. So there's going to be 2 people who are going to be the co-hosts of the show, okay? So their role is going to be to ask the questions, introduce the topic, and to, facilitate the engagement between the panelists and the audience as well. I've given them 3 support people in the production team, okay? You can decide on your role whether you're going to be a director who keeps the audience under control, keeps things on track, okay? So the production team, I think it says on my little pieces of paper, are the ones who are going to manage the time, right? They're going to make sure that we don't run over time and that we stay on track, and that if anybody gets anxious or tries to cause a commotion or is a protester in the audience, that they get dealt with, okay? And then I've got 5 guests. I've given you 5 suggestions, but you can come up with your own ideas as well. So you can create these characters. So we're going to have a government person. So someone's going to be the minister. They can choose. We'll see. Maybe it'll be someone else. We'll see that you can decide where you're from. You may even want to be someone like the ASEAN Secretariat instead. So that's a government role. Then we've got some business roles. Maybe somebody like the CEO of a Chamber of Commerce, or an American investor, for example, or a big multinational corporation CEO. Then we want to have a couple of smaller stakeholders, like a farmer or somebody who might be more protectionist about their interests, or an SME e-commerce entrepreneur. So these are ideas. If you get those, you can play with it, come up with your own personalities. Think about what their position is going to be, what their questions are. And then the rest of you are going to be the audience. You can also come up with your own personality and decide on your own approach, whether you're going to be a quiet audience member or whether you're going to be a disruptive audience member or whether you're going to be the smart audience member, okay, who asks sharp questions. So, we've got about an hour, haven't we, Suze? Yep. So we're going to take about 10 minutes or so to give you some time to prepare, to get into your character. That will give the co-hosts in particular and the show team time to just come together, just to figure out how they're going to start things off, and then we'll just get into it. So we just see where this takes us. It's an adventure today. And then I did come up with some types of questions. I actually just run this through Perplexity AI, and I said to my AI chat companion there, what could be examples of questions about US-ASEAN trade deals? And obviously there's not just one trade deal, but you can choose how you focus it. So you might want to talk about things like why they matter for ordinary people. How is it going to impact on prices for consumers? How is it going to impact on certain industries? What about the relationship between ASEAN and the US, ASEAN and China in the context of these deals? So these are really just a bit of inspiration for the hosts who can decide on how they want to tackle this. You can swap roles. Okay.
Maybe we should have a commercial break. A word from our sponsors. And we'll go up to level 3 for afternoon tea, and then we'll come back down, and then perhaps we can do the questions. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
I would like to come back at 3:15, if that's okay. Senator.
Very much, and I'm super impressed actually with your ability to do that with extremely short preparation time and no notice that that was what we were going to be doing today. So extremely well done to you all. I think that the conversation was very well mannered. So you were all very polite to each other, which is not always the case in these situations. But you know, that also gave the chance to have quite a substantive discussion. I was saying to Susanna just before the break that the last time I did a similar exercise was in Kenya earlier this year. And we actually had a physical tackling of one of the audience members by the security team. So you guys were very polite and very, very professional. So that was great. I think that you did extremely well. A lot of the panel used very clear examples, which I think was super helpful for trying to explain these technical issues. So, you know, the minister started talking about things like Google and Amazon and so on that anybody can relate to, really. And then the farmer and the investor spoke about jobs and incomes, which is always great because that's really what people want to know about, right? It's the day-to-day things. Is this going to cost me more to buy my iPhone, or am I going to lose my job? So those are really great to bring it down to the level of concrete stories, as I said, that people can get relate to in their day-to-day life. Watch the language a little bit on things like reciprocal and de minimis, because they're not necessarily terms that are that well understood, I would say, even in the trade policy space, let alone in the broader environment. So we did very well not to use a lot of acronyms, which was great, but just the odd trade speak crept in. And so if you are ever in the situation of talking about some of these issues, just think to yourself sometimes when you use words like that, if you have to actually pause and maybe just expand a little bit so that people are understanding what that means and they're coming along with you. But that's always a trap for people who work on these issues every day. I want to give a big shout out to the two audience people who I think probably did the really good role playing, which was our American friend and our Greenpeace representative. They both got into their characters and I think presented positions that were aligned with those ideas. So well done to you all and for taking it on with enthusiasm. I hope it made you think a little bit about stakeholder engagement and about communication, and I will be seeing you again on Thursday and we'll get into data, which is a little bit more boring, but hopefully we'll try and make it as fun as possible. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, and I look forward to having you back. Yes, great careers in communication and acting for some of you. If you want a career switch, I think you know which way you're going, and we know which way some people are going. Straight to the top. Okay, so for the last little bit, I wanted to just try and do some preparation work with you around your group projects. Because I've been ducking in and out, I'm not actually sure if anyone's even mentioned the group projects to you yet. Already. Yes? Already. And you're in your groups? Yes. Yes? Okay. So we're just going to do a bit of work on that this afternoon. So, these are not my slides, these are Jennifer's slides, so I'm going to hope that I actually know what's going on. So how far, can someone just give me a quick snapshot, how far are you in terms of the projects?
Very early in
You've picked your topic, okay?
Topic.
You have a template.
Utilizing.
Distributing roles? Okay. So I think probably the best thing to do is you don't need me to reinvent the wheel here. So I think just get into your groups and so I'll just give you these reminders again from Jen. That when you are thinking about your project, think about it on the domestic level and on the international level. And I think that TV show that we just watched demonstrated that you are already thinking on both of those levels. And then bringing in some of what Catherine was just saying about all of the different stakeholders that you might need to engage with depending on what your topic is. Think through who is involved, who will I need to engage with. And yeah, obviously the stuff that Catherine was talking about in her presentation is really useful, I think, in terms of trying to make a plan, not just who do I need to talk to, but how do I need to talk to them. So if it is fellow trade officials, that's fine. Then you can use your jargon and all of your expertise. If it is, you know, unemployed youth, for example, right, you're going to need to talk to them differently. If it is NGOs or rowdy Americans, right, think about how, if it's the minister, if it's, you know, your counterparts in business or community organizations, all of those will require a kind of different way of approaching those stakeholders and different ways of engaging with them. And I think one of the things, and you probably all know this, one of the things that generally the public communities find really annoying is when you pretend to do stakeholder engagement and you don't actually listen. You just carry on with what you were doing anyway. So think about what real engagement is going to look like as part of your thing. And thinking about, yes, all those different levels, what are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the risks? And how might you amplify the opportunities and mitigate the risks? Hepatai, any questions or comments at this point? No? Okay. Okay. So I think we'll just get into our groups and work on these questions. And if you can post your answers to the discussion board on Canvas so that Jennifer can have a look at what you've written before you do some more project work with her tomorrow morning. So this is where it is on Canvas. So that's the discussion board that you want to go to, your project questions and answers, and pop the stuff up on there so that Jennifer can have a look at it. I will, if you want me to, I'm very happy also to make a discussion board for the TV show if you want to carry on having those conversations. But yes, with what time we have left today, yeah, not much. But I think that was a really good exercise. It was nice for you to do something different. And I think there were some sort of really interesting things coming out of it. So I let it go into your project time. So I'm sorry about that, but I hope it was worth it. But now, yeah, for the last 10 minutes, if you can get started on, well, you're not going to do much more than get started. But yes, get into these questions in your groups and start sort of posting some things, notes on Canvas. Okay? Kapai? Right. What we'll do tomorrow with Jennifer is work on how you're going to present your projects on a poster. On a poster.
Do we need to upload our podcast in the Canvas for tonight, or tomorrow we can talk about it?
I think if you could put a few things in Canvas tonight, just so that Jennifer doesn't think I let you slack off. So that you can move on to tiba-tiba poster work tomorrow of how are you going to present your work. You're not going to present it until like another week. Yeah, you've got lots of time, so don't panic. But yeah, just getting the steps in place. Just some. You don't even have to do a draft poster. All we really want from you for now is some answers to these questions.
Answer this question.
A rough draft to